Everyone. Give it just a minute while everyone gets their sound connected. Good morning. Well, happy Friday to everyone. Lennon, will you be able to keep an eye on that waiting room? And I'll go ahead and get started. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Friday to join us for NACTEP's discussion panel this morning. We are super excited to discuss COVID, community colleges, and teacher education. Just a little bit about NACTEP. NACTEP has actually been started in about 2002, so quite a while. It was started with a grant at Maricopa Community Colleges here in Tempe, Arizona. We love doing the work of supporting teacher education, pre-service, in-service, and faculty who are have education programs, teacher education programs, and for all of you that are supporting teachers in the classroom. We all want the best in mind. We want those pre-K-12 students to have the best teacher. They deserve that. They deserve that education that connects with their teacher, that, including diversity. So it's super important. Our organization really tries to support faculty leaders and those going into the education profession. So I'm just going to take just a minute and introduce. We're so fortunate to have four amazing panelists here today. And I'll go ahead and start. And when I say your name, would you just mind giving a little wave? So Dr. Lewis, I know it, Andre Brownlee, he is at Mesa Community College. That's here in Arizona. And he has, he's an educator who's taught in the K-12 schools, community colleges, and universities for over a decade. Before becoming an educator, he worked as an engineer. He started his career as a civil engineer, designing infrastructure, projects, and systems. He's been able to use his expertise to advise students using the guided pathways system. So he has that lens as well. And he teaches courses in education studies, African American studies, and ethnic studies. So welcome, Andre. Thank you so much for joining us today. And then Dr. Jacob Ashby, he's from Frederick Community College in Maryland, and he is the Assistant Dean for Assessment and Articulation, and his expertise is in curriculum and instruction, articulation, assessment, planning, guided pathways as well, open education resources, multiple measures, and institutional effectiveness. So during the pandemic, he was able to serve in an interim capacity as the Associate Vice President of the Center for Teaching and Learning. And he provided oversight for the academic support areas. So we were all about, during the pandemic, monitoring and adjusting, right? So he jumped right in there. He has knowledge on accreditation process, and he serves on multiple Middle States Commission for Higher Education for the visiting teams, and most recently for co-chairing a successful, reaccreditation process. So welcome, Dr. Ashby. It's nice to have you this morning. Okay, Camille Catlett, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So Camille is a consultant based in Carrboro. Am I saying it correct? Good, North Carolina. And she's most recently worked with faculty and leaders in multiple states to incorporate an explicit and intentional effort on culture, equity, language, diversity, and inclusion in early childhood education. She's with that has been the special education coursework, field experience, and program practices. Her work has yielded a flexible and evidence-based model for increasing an emphasis on culture, race, and language in higher education curricula, field experiences, and the model she uses also includes an emphasis on children with disabilities and inclusion. So thank you for joining us, Camille. I love the lens of early childhood and coursework, field experience. That's wonderful. And Teresa, if you could give a little wave, Teresa. Teresa Robinson is from the Community College of Baltimore County. She's also in Maryland. She began her college careers at the community college level. Can I get a quick show of hands of who started their college career at the community college? I know I did. Oh, awesome. And then she continued her bachelor's in special education. She began teaching at the Maryland School for the Blind and has worked with children from ages birth to 21 years old of all ability levels. She was the owner and director of an early childhood learning center, and now she uses her expertise at the College of Baltimore County in Maryland in teacher education, and this allows her to teach early childhood education courses, special education courses, and she supervises internship experiences for students preparing to graduate. So Teresa, thank you for bringing your expertise here as well, and it's great to have you. Before we move on to our next section and begin, I just want to give a heartfelt thank you to Lennon Adrain. He has been masterful in setting up this discussion, the format, and so I just want to thank you very much. Lennon is an executive board member with NACTEP, and he's also the chair of the conference committee. So thank you very much, Lennon. You're amazing to say the least. So thank you. And then the next thing I just wanted to share just for a second, I'm going to share my screen with you just to share some upcoming events. So if you are new to NACTEP, this is your first NACTEP event, welcome. We're so glad to have you. We hope that this is the first of many events that you attend. We have events on monthly, sometimes more often than that. This month, in the month of April, we have obviously today, we have our panel discussion. We also have monthly coffee chats. And so I am excited to share that 1 week from today, we have Tim Newbert from the American Association of Employment and Education. And he's going to talk about the work that he does in preparing teachers, how his organization is positively impacting teacher preparation and recruitment and retention. So if you're available, you'll find this information right on our website, and all the information's right here. So it's just, if you have not had the opportunity to join a coffee chat, it's a great environment to just come, sit, relax, and just have a conversation with colleagues who have probably the same passion you have as working with teachers. And so we just share ideas. We have, if you visit our website under professional development and then go to coffee chats, you'll see the plethora of presenters that we have had over the last few years. And in some cases, we've recorded it. So if you're really interested in one, please reach out to us and we'd love to provide that for you. But these are just some of the advantages that you can use at NACTEP and all the resources. So I will say one other thing is, if you haven't considered a membership, please do so. We have on our website to become a member as low as $25 for a student, and then an institutional with up to 4 members. 5 members is $400. So consider that. You'll see that it's well worth it with all of the resources we provide. And I will end with, because I didn't start with, is my name is Julie Farron. I'm the Executive Director of NACTEP. I have been the Executive Director for the last 2 years. And I've been in teacher education for about 23 years. Started out as an elementary school teacher, and I've been, I guess, blessed to be at Rio Salado for the past 16, maybe 17 years in teacher education. I love kids, love being in the classroom, love visiting the classroom. I have now big kids, 20, 18, and 13. So I get to, live vicariously through the education system through them. And so I'm just happy to have you here. So welcome. Without further ado, Lennon, do you want me to hand it over to you?
Absolutely. Thank you, Julie. So welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started and jump right into it. Just so you all know, if you can't stay for the post-panel discussion portion of today, we'll have some discussion boards up on the Canvas site so that you can finish up to get those PD hours. If you do stay till the very end, at around, I think it's around like 10, well, here in Arizona, it'll be around 10:55. We'll drop that link in the chat. So that you don't have to do any of the discussion boards. You can just go straight to getting your certificate. But we're going to go ahead and get started. Andre, welcome. Thank you for being here today. Could you talk to us just a bit about how community colleges, or maybe your community college in particular, shifted during the pandemic? How did you see teacher education in particular shift at your college or at community colleges across the country?
That's a real good question. So I'm over at Mesa Community College. And so one of the I think the biggest challenges that we had was how do we allow students to get their service learning hours? That was the biggest challenge. So when students went from being able to go to neighboring districts, Chandler Unified, Tempe Unified, Mesa Public School District, and then when COVID happened, now we have to reimagine what that actually looks like. And so being aware of safety, being aware that schools have closed down, Ton, the division chair, Anna Perner, and many others created this virtual service learning project through, I think it's called Sanford Inspire. So they use a myriad of videos and things of that nature. And then also, it was difficult for students to get their fingerprint clearance card because it was such a long wait. And so they was able to work out a relationship with Mesa Public Schools where they chose 2 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, and 2 high schools that didn't require students to have a fingerprint clearance card to do their service learning hours. And then in addition, they allowed educators who was currently working in places of education to use their jobs. And so they were able to pivot within that space, number one. Number two is, the modes of modality to actually offer education. So when the in-person classrooms were shut down, the live online versions came about, but it was something new that everybody was doing. And it was like learning on the job, learning on the fly. And what the great thing was, the students extended a lot of grace to the educators to make that happen. And so we definitely see a navigation from textbooks to OERs, right? Because of what was going on during the pandemic. So I apologize if you hear any music in the background. I'm at a coffee shop. They're doing yard work where I live, and it's like lawnmowers and leaf blowers. So I had to come to the local coffee shop, you know what I mean? So, but I would say that's the adjustments they had to make. It was difficult at first, but we've made the adjustments. Now it's to the point that students enjoy the virtual service learning hours because they can do it in the comfort of their home and be with their families.
Thanks, Andre. Camille, how did you see community colleges and community college teacher ed shift?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Actually, one of the things that Andre mentioned that was one aspect of shift is the importance of relationships. So when you talk about being able to form a relationship with 2 middle schools, 2 high schools, I think the whole idea of how virtually do you form relationships with students? Do you form relationships among students? Do you build that sense of community? And I think, I know Danielle Savory Segerson of Lansing Community College is on the line. She was gracious enough to offer a free webinar for early childhood colleagues on effective strategies, resources for really building that capacity. I think I'm in a unique position in that I don't teach at a particular college or university. I'm in fact employed by several universities and work with multiple community colleges. So I was able to actually see this from a national perspective. And that aspect of relationship building is one component. I think another huge component was, while for most faculty, the idea of online or virtual delivery was a strategy, all of a sudden it became the strategy. And I think for many instructors who were so just marvelous at those hands-on examples and learning that involved manipulables and making things and trying things out and role playing, all of that disappeared. And so there were several things that happened as a result. Some of you may know that one of the projects I work on is a project called Script NC, and it's a project supporting community colleges here in North Carolina. One of the things that we did immediately was pull together, and literally programs were shut down in March. On March 31st, we offered a free webinar called Shifting Blackboards, the idea of going from a blackboard that you write on to a virtual blackboard. And as part of that, one of the things that we did is pull together as many examples of videotapes that might be used for observation, tapes that did not have narration, did not have voiceover, and the other things that would really allow that function. We also offered a feature, and all of these are posted and available for anybody who'd like the examples. We started offering what we call assignment makeovers, which is for faculty members to say, here's something I really love, that's a very effective thing that I do that I can no longer do the way I used to do it. What might be an option? And so those are two kinds of shifts and some examples of ways in which we've tried to be a resource to addressing them.
Thanks so much, Camille. And for everyone that's wondering where to find all these wonderful resources, we have a doc up on our Canvas site entitled Resources. And so you can find all the things that Camille is talking about. We'll put the things that Andre talked about there. And so thank you, Camille, for that. And it's so nice to have a national perspective. And so to shift a bit, I would love to talk to Jacob Ashby, because you aren't necessarily in teacher education, but you work in community colleges. And that's another perspective that's very important. And so maybe even outside of the realm of teacher ed, how did your community college writ large change, and how has it sustained change because and during COVID?
Sure, thank you. So just for a little bit of context, because I know my bio is slightly different and it was kind of addressed here. I just realized that I should be a consultant because basically I did all of what Camille did at my institution. So I think there's more money probably outside of higher ed. But as we transition, okay, maybe not. As we transitioned, really what we started to look at first was our learning formats. And the one good fortune that we had as an institution is just that we had implemented Blackboard across all of our courses previously, and it started to kind of leverage that as an additional resource, even in our face-to-face courses. So that did help with the transition. But our focus was really on supporting students and supporting faculty through this process. And Camille talked a little bit about a lot of the things that we did, but a lot of it was really talking to faculty about how they assess students, because a lot of teacher education faculty are used to the in-the-class assessments, in-the-class activities. And we talked a lot about student engagement because student engagement in a Zoom platform is a lot different than student engagement in the classroom. So that's really where our focus transitioned immediately when the pandemic hit. Another thing that I promoted and talked to our faculty a lot about, and this is a little bit of a soapbox for me, so I apologize, but is there's research called Illusions of Rigor, and we talk a lot about rigor as instructors, and we use that kind of as a weapon to not necessarily provide the supports we need to students, especially during a pandemic. So we talked a lot about the illusions of rigor and how to really support our students. And I'm a big fan of academic freedom and all that goes into that. But when I started teaching, I was a no late assignments type of faculty member, and there's a lot of ways to shift our approaches to both hold students to a specific standard, maintain that rigor, but also to provide the supports and provide the flexibility that people need, especially during a national pandemic. So those were kind of our big focuses when it first hit, and we moved everything, like I said, completely online. And we actually luckily had a spring break in there, so that was kind of a unique kind of benefit of ours. And the biggest thing that we noted kind of as a transition or an area of focus in the teacher education, in our AAT degrees, that's always my frame of reference. I know Teresa will recognize that as well from Maryland, is just that students didn't necessarily have the communication skills that we had experienced in the past because they didn't have that interaction. So that was something we had to kind of reinforce within the curriculum, especially and I'll get into some more detail with some of the other questions, but with less field experience and so on. So.
Thanks, Jacob. And you mentioned spring break, which is what Teresa is about to be on after this panel discussion. Super exciting for her. Yay, Teresa. Teresa, can you talk to us just a bit about how your college transitioned within teacher education or writ large because of COVID?
Okay, well, lots of similarities kind of across the board. But one of the things that we were lucky with when we made the transition was we hadn't had our spring break yet. So CCBC was very flexible and they rearranged the schedule so that faculty and students had spring break earlier in order to give them the time to prepare. And like Jacob was saying, pretty much all faculty had to have somewhat of an online presence through Blackboard. So the transition, it was still difficult for many who really just used it, to post grades and things like that. But for many, they were already using Blackboard in their face-to-face as well as their online or hybrid classes as well. So given that time to prepare, CCBC, because just like all community colleges, many of our students are at CCBC because it's the affordable option, as opposed to, getting into a 4-year program. We have many students that are non-traditional age with, many, many responsibilities beyond just being a full-time student. And, of course, there's that digital divide that everybody talks about, but definitely something that we saw in a huge way at every level of education when COVID hit. And CCBC tried to be proactive, and they created a computer lending program where students could come and pick up a computer if they didn't have one that they could use. So we have a lot of students that I have many, many students that would come in before class, after class, always come to campus to print their papers out, to do their papers, things like that. So they created that kind of lending program, which eventually became just a computer giveaway program. And then they also created hotspots on each of the campuses because a lot of our students also have connectivity issues. So, if they could make it to campus, they could at least, sit in their cars and work on things and utilize the hotspots and things like that. So CCBC really did try to do a tremendous amount to set everybody up to be as successful as possible. But one of the big things I think that we found is just defining flexibility all over again. Because under the circumstances, we had some students who were working in fields where they were at work all of the time. So due dates, things like that, we ended up having to be very flexible in how we did things, flexible in allowing students to be successful to the best of their ability. And, I think that for many of us, a lot of those things have even carried through to, things as they are now, recognizing that flexibility is extremely important, creativity, kind of thinking outside of the box, things like that.
Thanks, Teresa.
I also
go ahead.
I also did want to add in, because I didn't think about the service learning aspect of it until Andre brought it up. But when COVID hit, I had students that were right smack dab in the middle of their field-based experiences and in the middle of service learning experiences. And we happen to have connected with an organization called Reading Partners, who were absolutely amazing. So any of our students that were going into schools and working with students, Reading Partners worked really, really hard to turn that around into a virtual format so that tutors could still work with those students from the kindergarten to fourth grade level that were behind in reading. So that was something my students were actually able to continue with those experiences, meeting with students, virtually in their homes, which was really, really nice. And yeah, we definitely had to get a little bit creative with students finishing up their internship experiences. So.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you to revisit that just after I ask Camille to talk about it. So Camille, you mentioned this just a bit earlier. How did teacher candidates, did you see across the country at community colleges or at universities, how are they fulfilling their teacher candidate or their field experiences? Yeah. What worked? What didn't? And what do you think people will continue to do even after the pandemic to help students fulfill field experiences, to add some of that flexibility that Teresa talked about?
Yeah, and so let me divide the answers into a couple of different categories. So one area was, how could students possibly have the range of experiences in diverse quality environments that would prepare them to support each and every young child? And the answer was none of those were immediately available. And so I think one initial quest was for videotapes that might be used as an alternative way to provide a range of experiences. And I think part of what we discovered is that was something that we didn't have. I think in the intervening 2 years, projects like Early Ed University and others have really built up their repertoire. So what we now have, whether students are needing to see videos or just to supplemental materials, we now have better resources, and we're seeing more and more resources that present things not going perfectly, that present opportunities for students to strategize, to think about what they might have done more effectively. So that's one option. I think the second thing that happened in terms of experience with students is suddenly we became much more creative in what were the places where young children were learning. And we suddenly were contacting local childcare programs where children still were, to see if there was any possibility to film, and new relationships. Again, that path that Andre sent us down. I think one of the agents in successfully pivoting is, who might our new partners be with whom to be creative and to think differently. And suddenly we saw lots of different homegrown, local versions of what it might look like to see children in different settings each day, and to have opportunities to look at different experiences and how a talented early childhood educator might interact with those children. And we're also thinking about infants and toddlers. So I think also just how might those children be examples. A second aspect, because I know each of you is going to talk about field experiences, but another aspect that I wanted to make sure I mentioned was, all of a sudden, one of the things that also became apparent was that it was going to be possible for students to graduate and never having had a conversation with a family. And it was something that particularly, I'm working with a number of programs in Pennsylvania, and what they shared was that along with the lack of access to children came the lack of access to families. And one of the things that happened that was, again, an example of talented individuals putting their heads together, Pennsylvania happens to be a state that does a fabulous job of growing leadership among families. They have particular initiatives that support, for example, families who have very young children with disabilities to really learn the system and to become advocates and professional development providers. But what Pennsylvania did was to recruit, prepare, and support family members fiscally and organizationally to be resources to community college courses. So students would have an opportunity to interview a real family member, then to get feedback on what that conversation was like, or to ask for guidance and how would you approach this kind of a situation? What is your experience? What would you want someone to ask about your family in order to form an effective relationship? So I think The second component that we've not paid as much attention to is how are we bridging the gap of also making sure that in addition to supporting each and every child, we're really preparing talented educators who can form effective reciprocal relationships with their families and communities. So just a couple examples.
I appreciate that, Camila. And Teresa, you mentioned this briefly, and let's revisit it. What do you think worked? You were responsible, I know it, and I'm not even going to try to say the acronym because there are a lot of C's in there, and I'm going to confuse them all. But how did you shift? How did you shift? What worked? What didn't? What are you going to keep in your teacher ed program?
Well, I think the timing of the pandemic for the most part was right kind of at mid-semester. And for again, flexibility was a huge piece of it. Typically, our students have to do either a 45-hour internship or a 60-hour internship, depending on which courses they're taking. And that's with a mentor teacher, typically in a Baltimore County public school. So, for those that are go-getters, they have to do those hours over at least 9 weeks. Many of them already had at least their 45 hours and were getting close to, if they needed to, their 60 hours by midpoint. But these were the students that would have ended up with over 100 hours in their internships. So, we had to be as flexible as possible. For those that made their hours, they were good, and we did, and Frederick Community College was gracious enough to share a lot of their video library that we were able to utilize, along with some of the things that we had for students so that they could at least do their observations for assignments. And then in class, they were oftentimes talking points where students would break out into certain breakout rooms, if they watched a similar or the same clip, to talk about what they saw, so they could hear not just their own perspective, but other perspectives, and so forth and so on. For those that hadn't gotten their hours yet, they had the opportunity of using those videos. And for a very select, very lucky few students, they had mentors in the public school system that were really tech savvy and ready to kind of jump in and really take advantage of whatever they could as far as an online format with their students. And they were more than happy to continue on mentoring our students. But that was not the majority. For the most part, much of what we heard is, wow, this is going to be really, really tough. I still have to figure out what to do with my 4-year student teacher. So I'm sorry, your students are going to have to do something else because I've already got way too much on my plate. So many of my students ended up not having a mentor. So that's kind of where those videos came in. But kind of looking forward to what are we going to do the next semester? This is kind of what we're stuck with. We'll deal with it the best way that we can. But the following semester, we talked about, my placement coordinator and I talked about, just how flexible we need to be. It used to be that if students, we have a lot of students that are doing the AAS. And with the intent of working in and eventually owning their own childcare center. And it used to be that we strongly discouraged and didn't want students doing their internships in their place of employment, so that we'd have to find them someplace else and they'd have to make that time. Well, under the circumstances, if it's right in front of you, why not take advantage of it? So, we already had relationships with directors and things like that. So talking to them about, giving that person the opportunity maybe to work with a different mentor other than who they were working with. So at least, there was some separation. But we also, over the years have cultivated a relationship with the parochial schools, many of the private schools in the area who, went back to school that following August. For the most part, the schools that my students worked in they had about 50% of the students that were coming in virtually, and then 50% that were actually coming into the classroom. Social distancing, masking, the whole shebang was in place. So the following semester, kind of being proactive and figuring out how we can do this where we don't have people left high and dry and having to depend just on observing videos. We actually did either, students had a mentor where they worked virtually, or they were actually able to go into child care centers or to some of the parochial schools for that more face-to-face internship opportunity. And of course, those relationships are we're still being flexible. We're still, working with the parochial schools more so now than we ever have before. And I think that it really did kind of open a door to kind of forge new relationships and begin to look at things through a different lens, and realize that we can be a lot more flexible maybe than we had been in the past.
Thanks, Teresa. And so because you hit on it a bit in the other question, I'm going to ask Jacob to start this question for us. And Jacob, don't feel like, again, the teacher education space, like you're here because you're sort of not in it. And we like that perspective. And so what happened to community colleges? And maybe if you hit on the teacher ed part, were a lot of courses purely remote? Did you shift to hybrid? Were there any courses in particular that were remote versus hybrid? And then why did you make those decisions about those courses as opposed to others?
Sure. So I appreciate Teresa's kind of response on the last question. I want to kind of steal that format in the sense that there's kind of a timeline like everything else. When the pandemic first hit, we went 100% online like everyone else, right? Student and faculty safety became kind of the priority. We navigated that spring semester, and then we came together as a leadership team and started to talk about, what's our next steps, right? And at our institution, I'm sure it's similar with most of yours. Summer's kind of, just summer. It's a small offering, so we focused on fall. So when we talked about fall, we actually created 3 learning formats. One of them being online, which is just your traditional online asynchronous course, excuse me. But we created what's called synchronous online, which was basically a synchronous online course in a Zoom session like this. And then we created something called hybrid remote, which this was the first time we had ever done this. Everyone else, I'm sure, has traditional hybrid courses where you're partially online and partially face-to-face. But for us, hybrid remote was a format in which students were on campus for one day during the week and, masked. And then during the other session, they were remote. And what we were able to do through that was basically talk with our faculty and consider what we were teaching so that we could teach half the class, in that face-to-face format, and then the other half the class during the other session, and have the other ones doing work online from a synchronous perspective. It doubled, obviously, the faculty workload, and that was something we had to navigate as we moved forward. And we eventually started to implement what is referred to as high flex, although we didn't have a traditional high flex model because we didn't offer the asynchronous online along with it. But we started to move towards that format to leverage the hybrid remote even further as we transition through the semesters. And that involves, putting cameras and television screens and, wiring up classrooms. So all of this was a progression as we kind of went through the programs. When we started, obviously we focused, and from a college perspective, we focused on those important courses that have to happen in a face-to-face format, like biology labs, although there is technology that supports that, nursing and our allied health programs. Those are really kind of our formats. Traditional programs like business and computer science, they've been doing things online for years, so that wasn't as much of something that we need to leverage. In terms of teacher ed, just to kind of hop to that format, we offered at the start, just like everything else, pretty much everything online. And then we started to basically go through our offerings and look at how we could make sure there was courses available to students both in the online format and in other formats. So for example, we started with our schools and societies just because of the flexibility and the teachers that were available to teach that class and willing to come to campus. And we started to offer some hybrid remote sections. And then as we transitioned slowly through this process, we started to open up more and more hybrid remote offerings. And then now, obviously, we're back to kind of our new normal of face-to-face. Although I do want to highlight that we are starting to leverage those new formats in our new normal. So structured remote, a synchronous online course is going to remain in our offerings because there are students that benefit from that format. And we are going to continue to leverage some of our HyFlex technology. Again, we use it in a hybrid remote format so students can be synchronous at home and synchronous in class. We don't do the asynchronous component that if you look up a traditional HyFlex model. But we are going to leverage those formats and continue to integrate them into our traditional offerings of both face-to-face and online. So.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. And Camille, what did you see as a national, someone who, is 30,000 feet, what did you see people doing? What courses, of course, they're in early childhood. And you mentioned, access to families. So what did you see shift to remote or hybrid? What's going to stay? What do you see as staying?
Well, I think what I saw and the timeline that Jacob provided is one that mirrors what I saw initially, but it's actually what I'm still seeing. There are many of the programs that I work with that are still entirely virtual, and or some component that is largely virtual. And I think what it has offered is some challenges, which I've seen met in interesting ways, and also some opportunities. I think one of the opportunities, and this actually connects also to the example of having more videotape examples, is I think greater opportunities to really incorporate an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because a priority that I really have is that anyone who's going to be an early childhood educator has seen what a quality, inclusive environment looks like. We can't rely on osmosis as a strategy through which somehow students will magically intuit that the way that you individualize in an inclusive setting is something that they will be able to dream up. And so one of the things that we have are now much more diverse examples that feature classrooms in which high quality instruction is being provided to children who are dual language learners, and to children who are racially and ethnically diverse, and to children who are diverse in ability, and classrooms with all of those, so that there are multiple opportunities for students to watch initially and say, what about this is interesting, engaging, but then to also say, using your evidence-based tools, what are the practices that you see that are implemented for this child who is a child with an IEP, that also are supporting this child who's a dual language learner. So I think the chance to use technology in ways that students can watch something more than once, see it through increasingly advancing lenses, is a real asset that I continue to see incorporated into the work that faculty are doing. The other thing that I think the shift to far more virtual time brought was the opportunity to really, hopefully, pay more and more attention to our pedagogy, because I think one of the things that faculty have learned is not only how to use Zoom, but how to use other aspects of technology to support learners who learn differently. So just one example, I give the example of students not having access to families. One of the ways that some of the faculty members that I've had a chance to interact with have pivoted, and I that word is something that is now a part of my standard vocabulary, because I wish we could really build pivotability into what we're preparing early childhood educators for. But pivotability includes for students to have the opportunity to learn about what are the most effective practices for a reciprocal conversation with families. What are the evidence-based practices then? What might that look like? Then an opportunity or opportunities to practice that. And that's something that students can do on their phones with each other. But what I love is having them set up a 3-partner conversation where someone is an observer saying, gosh, I love the way you asked that question of the student playing the family member, because it really reflects an insight to this. Also, this becomes a way for students then, as part of how they respond to the assignment, to really build a model for what a thoughtful conversation for a first encounter with a new family might be. They can then videotape them role playing that, and that becomes how they document both the connections to evidence-based practices, their comfort from opportunities to practice, and their ability to do that. And imagine too, for students who are adult English learners in these early childhood settings, what would it be like if they were able to practice that first encounter in the language in which they're most comfortable, and then as the vocabulary gets more and more familiar, to practice that in English, so that they really build in their comfort and capability with both the content and the actual skill. So those are a couple examples.
Wow, thanks, Camille. I appreciate that. And it's, we talk a lot about the pivots and and one of the things, I think, two of the things that I just heard the other day, someone say is that, we don't like being isolated, we don't like being inflexible. And sometimes teaching is like that. And so finding ways for other people to be coached and to develop teams and communities of practice is really important. And speaking of and these connections and relationships, which we've hit on throughout this panel, Teresa, I would like to turn it back to you to talk a little bit about advising. We know relationships were important during the pandemic, and the balance between keeping students on track academically while balancing needs at home was really important. So could you talk a little bit about how you continue to advise during COVID and what things you might continue to do?
Well, we've always encouraged all of our teacher ed students to go to faculty advisors as opposed to academic advising, because we know the program much more intimately, and we're very confusing, when the academic advisors are kind of jacks of all trades, it's really hard to know all those nuances about each of the degrees. So the nice part is between the campus coordinators and really, I work with a fabulous faculty who take it upon themselves to kind of reach out, connect with, and if they don't have the answer, sending them to the right people that do. But during COVID, it wasn't like they could stop by your office. You could say, hey, in class, I need to talk to you for a couple minutes after class or whatever. And there were times where I would say, hey, I need somebody to stick around for a minute or so after class, but they would forget. And, when Zoom, when everybody started leaving Zoom, they were leaving Zoom and I couldn't, call after them. So, connecting with them, keeping up with them via email, if they weren't in class, actually taking the time to reach out to say, hey, is everything okay? What's going on? And also, connecting with other faculty too, because a lot of times I'm not the only person that has a certain student. I know that we had some students that really seemed to be struggling, and between myself and one or two other faculty, we were all seeing the same thing. Everybody was reaching out, coming up with solutions. So again, flexibility, creativity, and the one thing I think that many people realize, my office hours are this time to this time. Well, virtual office hours, I can be online, but what if it doesn't work for this person? So, meeting with students when it was convenient for them as opposed to when it's most convenient for me. Because, when you're at home, it's not really all that difficult to sit behind your computer and open a Zoom chat and actually talk to somebody to find out what's going on, what kind of support do they need, what can I do to help you get from point A to point B. And our faculty did that extremely well. Professor Mears Gaman is in here somewhere. I mean, she and I know, talked about several students over the course of the time during COVID, along with other faculty, and, really made a conscious effort to figure out how we can set these students up for success in a way that was going to work for everybody. But just to kind of leave everybody out there hanging in this virtual space just didn't seem quite fair. So it takes a little time, a little bit of effort, but I think it was well worth it. So I don't know. Did I answer the question?
Yeah. Yes. No. Thank you, Teresa. And perfect from the teacher ed perspective. Jacob, I would love to hear anything that you have institutionally that you saw, anything with teacher ed or anything that required a clinical component. I mean, you mentioned nursing earlier. Anything that required a clinical component needed something different in terms of advising. And so if you could talk a bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. So we the focus when we started with the pandemic, when the pandemic kind of hit, was really kind of honing in on our case management model. And we have a little bit of a different approach in the sense that we don't really use faculty advisors as much. So for us, specific to the education program, it's our education program manager, who's actually an administrative position. So that was really kind of the focus there. And in terms of our advising office, obviously, we have specific assigned advisors for each of our case management. So it was really about creating those caseloads and making sure we had constant contact with students to help them navigate the process. I don't want to minimize faculty. That was not my point in kind of taking them out of that model, because we relied on faculty heavily because they had the everyday interactions. So we were often reaching out to faculty. We have a much like many institutions, we have what we call a success alert, which is just kind of an early alert system. So we were always working with faculty and coordinating with faculty to identify students who are struggling early, make sure we got that communication both from the faculty member. It's basically an alert sent from the faculty member that tells them to come talk to them, but also to their caseload advisor, et cetera. The biggest benefit that I saw from a support perspective and kind of a student growth perspective was we were able to empower students through the use of web technology. Because in the past, when I'd seen students, and I actually used to be an advisor back in the day, I've had a lot of different hats in higher ed. But in the past, when I had seen advisors meet with students as well as with program managers meet with students, it was also often a format where we were sitting on the opposite side of a desk and we were walking them through the process and we were going over their pathway. We might have a paper that we put in front of them and kind of walk through it. But we were doing things on the computer, so on and so forth. But leveraging web technology, we were actually able to walk students through the process of what we were doing and really empower them and teach them how to manage their pathway, how to look at their career plan and see where they're at in terms of their academic goals and academic course progress. We were able to show them how to register. So it really gave us an opportunity to really empower students. And I think there was a lot of growth there from a student perspective. We now see when they come in for advising, both with caseload advisors and with their education program and other programs, that they kind of already know how to do some of the things. It gives them more of an opportunity to do both the career kind of coaching as well as the academic coaching, and less of the advisor kind of sitting through and how do I click into this registration platform and make sure the student has the right schedule. Students kind of know that more effectively after the 2 years, year and a half, whatever it worked out to be, of navigating this pandemic. So that's one of the things that I really saw a lot of growth in terms of kind of how we've managed our advising process at our institution.
Thanks. And Jacob, I'm going to send another question your way.
Sure.
As someone that works as up in admin, what have the conversations been about bachelor's degrees? We know that community colleges are considering them. Some already have them. For teacher education, what are the affordances that you're hearing? What are the constraints?
Sure. So it actually was CCBC, interestingly enough, but back in the day, let me kind of restart. So I work in the articulation area in Maryland, and there's been some issues with transfer in the state of Maryland, just generally with trying to get four-year institutions to accept credits. And I know that's not unique to Maryland, but there's been some major issues. And I've been involved in at least 5 or 6 statewide groups where I've been either in a leadership role or participative role where we've talked about transfer. And for those of you that have done this, it's like, I did this 3 years ago, I did this 5 years ago, and it's just kind of the same process over and over and over again with limited progress. So a few years back, credit to CCBC, they started to articulate some bachelor's degree programs that they wanted to offer in the state. It kind of called a big brouhaha, and there was some pushback from MHEC, which is our governing body, and that kind of fizzled out. We have not really had discussions about education-based bachelor's degree programs, but that was our bachelor's degree programs. But I did want to take this opportunity to highlight our AAT programs. So in the state of Maryland, we have our AAT programs that are designed in coordination with the 4-year and the 2 years, and it kind of create that seamless transfer. It's not always perfect, but it's much better than any of the other programs in the state. And I mean much when I say that. So we have that kind of seamless transfer that happens with the students. And that's part of the reason that we haven't talked about bachelor's degrees at the same level as some of the other states that still have those transfer issues. And we now have a bill that just passed, and then I'll let Teresa kind of hop in for transfer for success is what's called. It's from the state legislature, excuse me, and they've put a lot of standards in the state of Maryland that are going to change transfer for us. Like as an example, in the state of Maryland, once this bill is enacted, if 70% of the learning outcomes at a 2-year and a 4-year institution match, then the course has to transfer. So that creates a different standard than what a lot of people are dealing with nationally. So it's starting to create a model where transfer is going to be more effective for students. and I'll let Teresa hop in.
Well, I just wanted to say one thing. Because I think at this point in time, yeah, that allowing the 2 years to kind of have a piece of that has been a huge struggle. And I think recently a door has been opened up, and it's something that CCBC is jumping through, is working with we have cohorts now through Baltimore County Public Schools for those that are on provisional certificates, as well as cohorts for those paras that want to continue on to get their bachelor's degree. So, we are doing something with that, and are definitely taking some things forward, but also with the parochial schools where we will be, at this point in time, one of the only schools that is going to be working with the parochial schools to work with those people that are not yet certified, to get them certified. So this is something that's kind of in the works, and is something that the ground is being laid now. And I don't have all the specifics, and I wish I had brought all of the notes that I took from the last meeting. But it's kind of exciting because this is now, for the first time, kind of opening up that doorway somewhat. And if we can step through, others are hopefully going to be able to step through as well. So it's kind of exciting at this point in time. And I do know Professor Mears Gaman is on here somewhere. If she wanted to kind of jump in and piggyback on anything that I've said, please do, because you probably are remembering some things, maybe that I'm not remembering. So, but yeah, it's kind of an exciting time to kind of see where we're going to be going.
Thanks, Teresa. I appreciate that perspective. It kind of sounds like a post-bac situation, which Rio Salado College has. And so I'm going to pass it over. Andre, I would love to hear. Mesa, Arizona has this bill. I live in Arizona. That's why I know this. Andre, talk to us about what's going on, the conversations that are happening around bachelor's degrees here in Arizona, because they're in education, because they're happening. It's not just, we're not fighting for this anymore. What does that look like?
Well, at Mesa Community College, they're rolling out in fall 2023. I think it's a Bachelor's of Arts in Early Childhood with a certification or endorsement in dual language. And so when you do the math, $85 a credit times 120 credits, you're talking about less than $11,000. The students can go to school and get a degree. That's not including fees and things of that nature. And so it's an opportunity for us to recruit students from Mesa Public School, groom them, train them at our schools, have them do their service learning hours at Mesa Public School, and then send them back there. And that's like a pipeline. I don't like using that term too often because I think it's overused, but it's just having that relationship definitely with the community. And also it just allows us the opportunity to have those discussions about belonging, diversity, equity, inclusion, because the student demographic has definitely changed in Mesa. Now the teachers haven't, but the students have. So we can have that discussion around poverty, that maybe intersects with race, that may intersect with class or sexual orientation. And so we can have those critical reflection, critical inquiry conversations versus them maybe going to another institution who's not aware of those communities and their needs and then sending them back. And then we're directly right there in the mix of everything.
Thanks. And Andre, you hit on the last question that we're asking to wrap it up, and I saved it for last because I think it's the most important one, and I wanted to give time for discussion. So you mentioned diversity, and I don't like the word pipeline either. I like pathways instead. It gives, it's a choice. It's a feeling of choice, and it's not. I don't feel like we're putting anyone any place. So how do you see community colleges, now that you've worked at them, and now that you compared to universities, playing a role in diversifying the teacher workforce, and how can we make teacher education at community colleges more equitable and more inclusive?
That's a good conversation. Are you talking about the faculty side or are you talking about the student side?
Pick. You can pick, and then we'll have other panelists, whatever you feel most called to do.
You know what? That's a great question because I was just informed by my division chair, Ton, that my OYO would not be extended to next year. And so I have to go back to my previous institution and work in student affairs. I'm an educator. I worked in student affairs just to get my foot into the door. I don't mind advising students, but I didn't go get a PhD in education to advise. So one of the conversations that Ton and I talked about was like, how do you bring center education into the conversation about DEI, right? And how do you filter every class that you create through a DEI lens and not just focus on this one class that you have to take called diversity in education? So I'll talk about it from that pathway, the curriculum, and also recruiting faculty. I think it really depends on the president and what they value at the school, right? And the vice president. If there's something they value, then they can put an emphasis on it. What we're starting to see is that, this is my personal opinion, that STEM is the conversation right now, right? And so, but education is like the stepchild of the community college, right? And they're typically, from my opinion, underfunded. And so we're teaching multiple classes, extending ourselves to the communities, working ourselves into anxiety. But I just think, we got to put more of an emphasis on that, because at the end of the day, it's really about funding and creating that space. So when my division chair called me last night, it was like, yeah, we're not going to be able to bring you back. That's juxtapose the idea of bringing a bachelor's of arts degree to the community college, because you're going to need people to teach those classes, right? So who's going to teach the 300 and 400 level classes, right? And that's the conversation. But then to flip on the B side and talk about the curriculum, all curriculum needs to be, designed around this universal design for learning. And so I like to approach it from three perspectives: content mastery, pedagogy, and critical reflection. It's okay to master your content. It's okay to have the pedagogy, but how do I challenge your disposition so you can see your own biases, right? All the safe word and buzzwords to say, but how are we able to challenge your disposition to make sure you're seeing students and for who they are and understand what they need? So in my courses, if it's special education, we talk about the intersectionalities of poverty, class, and racism. If it's introduction to education, we talk about the intersectionality of class, racism, and poverty. No class is excluded from having those conversations, no matter what the subject is, because no matter what, those are things that students are going to interact with when they get in the classroom. What I've seen in the past is when students get into the classroom, their dispositions interfere with them teaching the lesson, right? You can feel any way you want to feel politically, religiously, that's your perspective, but you got to be able to compartmentalize that and understand to teach the students equitably. And we have to challenge that in our courses. We can't just give them, cultural holidays or food and festivals, right? We got to be able to engage in these critical reflections and say, I have a bias in this area. I need to work on that. Or I don't have a lot of conversation about me, a lot of information about this area. So my job as an educator is to make you look in the mirror and say, I need to engage in some critical reflection, right? And one thing I share with my students is that we all have biases. So to sum it up, I would love to stay at Mesa Community College, but obviously they don't see a need for my services. And so how do we change that narrative? I think it just comes down to funding and the perspective of the administration and leadership that's there. They have to make it important.
Awesome. Thanks, Andre. I appreciate that perspective and your framing about just what we should be critical and reflective on in our curriculum and pedagogy. And Camille, you talked earlier about equity. Early childhood, such an important time. We know not only is our K-12 student demographic changing significantly in the US, but students are coming now, as Andre mentioned, from a bunch of different backgrounds. They're multilingual learners. They're learners that come from diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds. We can't fit people in boxes anymore. What do you perceive community colleges to be, and what role do they play in equity, inclusion, and diversity? Oh, and I'm sorry, I think you're muted.
I think Andre divided it nicely, saying, I think a part of this conversation is about what are we doing differently with students? And I think a part of this conversation is what are we doing differently with ourselves? Because I think one issue, I think there's a massive shortage of high quality professional development for faculty on how to incorporate new content, how to bring new lenses. And I think just this whole idea of how can we change what we're doing. One of the things, the U.S. Department of Education has funded 6 projects to work exclusively with programs, early childhood programs and community colleges, to increase the emphasis in those programs on inclusion of children with disabilities and also issues of culture, race, equity. And so as a result, there are programs in those 6 325N locations and additional resources for doing that. So I think there are new materials. Simultaneously, one of the things that has happened during the pandemic is some very exciting development in resources to support the shifts that faculty can make. I'm thinking, for example, of one new resource that organizes the whole notion of culturally responsive teaching into competencies that are actionable and has a companion guide of reflection questions for students to really explore what is it that I bring to this conversation? What are my presumptions? And I think we have new tools. I think we have new opportunities as part of assignments to not just say, how would you design this center? But what does the NAEYC position on equity have to say about what you need to think about as you design this center? And I think we have new ways of connecting our evidence sources with where students are getting ideas, how they're applying those ideas, and just reconceptualizing how much bringing new lenses and becoming more reflective is a component of professionalism. So that brings up the question of, what are some of the things that we also do differently with students? And part of that is, I think I am so pleased that the idea of universal design for learning is another concept that Andre brought to this. We need to be preparing students who are well-versed in how to use those approaches to support each and every child. But we also need to be well-versed in how to use those approaches to support each and every student. I will give you an example. In one of the programs I work with, there is a significant population of early childhood students who are Chaldean. They have come to this community from the Middle East. They were originally speakers of Aramaic or Arabic. They are learning English by and large. And one of the concepts that this community college shared is that they're struggling with the idea of reflection. We just want to know, what's the right answer? Tell me the right answer so I will know what to say. And part of what we were able to do is to unpack culturally is the idea of pondering the answer that you've been given or the direction you've been given or what you know to do, an appropriate thing to do. And when you have grown up in a context in which someone makes the rules and someone imposes the decisions, questioning those, examining those, unpacking those is a very culturally laden concept. So one of the things that has happened at this program is they've actually shifted how they unpack the idea of that incredibly valued component of early childhood education, which is reflection and change as a part of professionalism and growth. So those are a couple examples. I have others, but Andre's hand is up and I want to honor that.
Go ahead, Andre.
So last summer, we all met at Tun's house, probably about 6 or 7 of us, and having a discussion. And one of the things that came up was, how do we reimagine what a student looks like or what its tools a student needs post-COVID, right? What does that student need? Because COVID revealed a lot of things. There are health inequities, there's technology inequities, there is a need to talk about social justice, to not skirt around it because your student's gonna ask those questions. We didn't come up with an answer, but we had to reimagine what that is. And I think the conclusion we came to was it really starts with us, right? And so we can no longer do business as usual, right? But now teachers going to be technologically savvy. They're going to need certain software and tools with that, but also they're going to know how to engage with those difficult conversations, no matter what the subject is. So I give you an example. Recently, I did a presentation for Edinburgh University talking about culture relevant teaching and culture relevant culturally responsive teaching. And a young lady who said she was in biology class teaching about gender, or teaching about gender, X and XY chromosomes. And the student raised their hand, was like, well, what about transgender students? And she was stumped. And she says, I never thought about having that conversation in my class because I'm teaching biology. And she didn't have the tools to do that. And so I gave her some advice on how to engage with those conversations. But what I told her at the end of the day, if you don't know, just say you don't know. Let me go do some research and come back and have that discussion. But she just said she just blew right past it because she felt intimidated about having that conversation. Right, around sexual orientation, around gender, around gender roles, around transgender women, transgender men. And she didn't feel adequate to have that conversation. But that's what the student in post-COVID, they're gonna have to learn how to have those conversations because they're gonna come up.
Appreciate that, Andre. And Teresa, what are you seeing as a role in Maryland around DEI and community colleges and teacher education?
Well, I guess Camille and Andre definitely hit on a lot of the things that I want to talk about. But I think one of the things that is so important is that critical self-reflection. And maybe because I come from the background that I do, working with, my last 11 years was teaching in a school, was working with infants and toddlers statewide. So I was going into mansions in Potomac, Maryland, slums in Baltimore City in the same day, to the Eastern Shore, where working with people that, very well off to one house that I went to, they didn't even have a bathroom inside. They had to use the outhouse, so just kind of those disparities when we talk about socioeconomic disparities and differences. And one of the things that in every class I teach, I talk about being critically self-reflective and recognizing and admitting that each and every one of us brings bias to the table, whether or not we want to admit it. That's a hard pill to swallow if you have spent your lifetime thinking that you're open-minded and that you're not biased in any way. We all bring something to the table. And how do we unpack that and leave that baggage at the door when we walk into our classrooms? So that's a huge, my students, I found an article years ago called Mindful Reflection as a Process for developing culturally responsive teaching. And until I find something better, my students will continue to read it again and again and again, because it really, really hits the nail on the head. And I mean, to this day, I still have students that will say to me, oh, I thought about it and I have no biases whatsoever. And I'm like, well, go back and think about it some more, because we've all got it. And, it is, when we talk about diversity in our classrooms, it runs the gamut. Gender identity, socioeconomics, culture, religion, you name it, it's there. And we have to enter our classrooms in a way where we can begin to recognize that. And just another thing that I think is really important is that we have to understand who our students are, not just what their names are, not just that they're a student in my class at CCBC, but where do they come from? Because many of our students are English is their second language. And for those where English is their first language, maybe they're only second or third generation. And I guess this comes from my days with infants and toddlers. Working at Maryland School for the Blind, people from all over the world came to Hopkins and stayed at Hopkins Children's Center. So I spent a huge part of my career working with families where there was no similar language. And I had to do my research. When I go into a house, is it a patriarchal household, multi-generational patriarchal household? Most people here, when we go into a household to work with a child, we automatically address the mom. Well, in some houses, that's disrespectful. You should be addressing the eldest male of the house, which in some cases is the grandfather. So, it does. It takes. We have to do our research, and our students are going to have to recognize that they're going to have to do their research as well. Because really some of this comes down to developing those mutually respectful relationships and how important they are in our own classrooms, whether it's college or elementary or high school. And out of that comes the responsibility of doing our homework to understand where our students come from, where their families come from. And I've probably not said a few other things, but I guess I'll stop there, and definitely I'm up for a conversation on this. So.
And thank you, Teresa. That's a perfect segue. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.